Thank you so much for coming, everybody. My name is Alice Pistono, and today we're going to have a really interesting session. So first of all, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. So as I was saying, I'm a curriculum specialist here at JoVE, which is the world's leading producer and publisher of STEM videos. So today's session is going to be particularly interesting, I think, for all of those who are tackling the difficult world of early career research. And in particular, what we're going to talk about is how to be successful in this process of entering the career, the career as a research and move your first steps towards it. Now, the early career phase can be really challenging. We all know that. But the right guidance, the right strategies can really help us find a way towards success, towards being successful in this endeavor. So for our session today, and I hope everybody will join me in having a really nice discussion with this person, we have a distinguished scientist, our Dr. Nikolai Slavov, who's an associate professor at Northeastern University College of Engineering. And what he's going to do with us today is share his insights and experiences on how we can plan the early career phase in particular, and especially how to emerge in a successful way. Now, without further ado, I would love to extend a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Nikolai Slavov. Well, thanks for joining us today, first of all. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be able to share some of my thinking on this very important topic that has occupied much of my time, especially when I was younger and I was thinking of what should be my strategy, what it is that I really want to achieve. And I'm going to start by saying that this is a very large area that we can spend hours and hours discussing. And I'm not going to endeavor to comprehensively discuss every single aspect of it, but I'm going to emphasize a couple of key aspects that I think are particularly influential and within the sphere of influence of young researchers, things that can really make a difference in your career. What I'm going to say applies equally to research within academia and outside of academia. Traditionally, we think of research happening very much at universities, but increasingly that's also happening within nonprofit research institutes. It's happening also to some extent within corporations. And the three parts of my presentation will include choosing a direction and strategy of your research, some guidance on how to communicate your results, what are effective ways of doing that, and how to recruit, how to secure resources, how to raise funding for your research. Choosing a direction is exceptionally difficult. I think that this is an underappreciated aspect of research. We all know that working hard is important, and it's very difficult to succeed without working hard, but if you work hard without a good direction, you'll get nowhere. And choosing a direction that is strategically competitive for you, that can advance science and that you can accomplish and deliver on, is something that is highly dependent on your environment and also a place where you can exercise your creativity. It is certainly constrained by resources, that's the bad news, but you shouldn't think of that as being severely limited necessarily by resources. Resources provide a constraint, but they also leave a lot of space within which you can choose what makes the most sense for you. And that, again, as I mentioned previously, is an opportunity for you to shine and to use your critical creative thinking. Sometimes people get discouraged from limitations on what they can do because of access to resources. But I think emphasizing the limitation is looking on the glass being half empty. I think it's more productive to think on the glass being half full, because even in very resource-constrained environments, as I'm going to share with you, I think that there are a lot of opportunities for creative minds to use this powerful lever. You might think that there are lots of great things to do. After all, every day, prestigious journals publish perspectives and review articles that specifically articulate opportunities for doing research. And most of these opportunities are not great for you unless you are a well-funded principal investigator at a highly resourced institution, because those very obvious directions are going to be pursued by people with more resources, better logistics, and it's very difficult to compete with them. The other aspect to that is that even if you can compete, even if you're one of those highly funded PIs, by pursuing such an obvious direction, you're not really accelerating research. People may claim that, but the truth is, if one person doesn't do it, if one lab doesn't do it, then another lab is going to do it. So I think the challenge here is really to identify new opportunities that are going to be very fruitful, but are underappreciated. And that's a niche within which a junior person can have a chance to jumpstart their career. So assuming that you've chosen a good direction, you've done the hardest part, I'll share with you some thoughts on how to communicate the results that you obtained following this direction that you've chosen. A big part of our communication happens via writing academic papers. And when you write a paper, I think it's really useful to start by knowing what is your message. And the message is, it's easiest to write a strong paper if it's focused on one or two important claims. And the introduction that you provide doesn't need to be full review of the entire research field. You need to provide objective summary of what is needed for readers to appreciate the significance of what you have done. And then you have to think very hard about structuring the information. So when I think about writing a research article or writing a review perspective, for me, this is much more of a thinking exercise than a writing exercise. It's almost a misnomer to call it writing. I think it should be called intense thinking, articulating ideas. And a couple of guiding principles for me are to always start with the question, why? This doesn't come intuitively to students, especially early on, because you spend most of your time on how and what. You spend a lot of time on thinking how to do it, on the exact methods, but unless you tell your audience why you did what you did, they're not going to care about what you did. So starting with why is one of those really simple key principles of communication that is oftentimes violated. And even when I teach students to start with why, it oftentimes takes multiple reminders to build up the habit and to actually start doing that. And as you write, you should make the most general statements that you can make supported by your data, and and be very specific, not try to say something that is vague, but stay within the constraints of what your data can support. There are a lot of resources that you can find on effective writing. Here I share one of the more famous examples of structuring an abstract and introduction for Nature, but this is generally applicable for writing the introduction of any paper for any journal. And again, this example provides guidance on how we can start with why, with the more general to the more specific, and then go again to the more general statement that you can make. So I want to come back to this aspect of limited resources, for which I already remarked that resources set a certain constraint, and I think it's common for researchers to feel discouraged when they see that there are other groups that have much more resources. How can you possibly compete and shine when working with another group that has 10 times more resources? And if one starts thinking too much about that, I think it can have a very inhibitory effect on your creativity and what you do. And I never saw limited resources as being a reason to despair. I saw it as a reason to really be inspired how to overcome this limitation. So if you have limited resources, then you have to be resourceful. What do I mean by being resourceful? I mean just acknowledging all the limitations that not having access to the best equipment imposes to you, and then asking yourself, within that constrained space that I have, what is the most influential, worthwhile thing that I'm really excited about that I would like to do? And do it as best as you can. And when you do it, then you can slightly enlarge your pie of resources, and you can do the next thing and do the next thing. And this is something that I've seen work a number of times for different people, including in my own experience. When I started my research group here at Northeastern University, I did not have resources to purchase essential instruments for my experiments. And in one way, this might have seemed really despondent, and they could have said, well, if I don't have instrumentation, what am I even doing? But I found a collaborator at Harvard who had access to those instruments and started using those as an example, which allowed us to make the first step. And then that allowed us to raise funding, and that allowed us to purchase instruments, and so on and so forth. And in fact, today we'll be announcing the establishment of a new research institute that is funded with very substantially, that has resources to purchase dozens and dozens of instruments from the kind that they couldn't purchase when I was starting. But I think this aspect of resource limitation and resourcefulness continues to apply, because I don't see resources as being my competitive edge. I would much rather like to think that our ideas and strategy is what makes us competitive, rather than merely being fortunate to have access to resources. So if you don't have a lot of resources, the way to get more is to write proposals. And this applies to everybody who wants to be independent. There's a lot of complaints within the research community, certainly the academic community, about the difficulty of writing proposals and the frustration of those proposals being rejected. But if you think about it deeply, you realize that the only way to be independent, the only way to really be a principal investigator, is to have resources one way or another. And unless you're a wealthy, independently wealthy person, inherited a lot of wealth from your parents, being independent researcher and being a PI would require writing proposals in one way or another. And everybody can write proposals from early on, including students and postdocs, and of course PIs. We all write proposals, and I think starting to exercise your skills of writing proposals early on can be very helpful. Helpful beyond securing the money from a particular proposal, helpful in teaching you how to write effective proposals. And to write a good proposal, you need to start with a good question. You absolutely cannot write a good proposal if you don't have good premise, if you have not identified something worthwhile doing. Then the rest of what you're going to do doesn't matter. You might be the best writer that there ever has existed on this planet, but without a good question, without a good why, writing a strong proposal doesn't work. And then you need to have a compelling way to show that you're the right person to answer it, and that you have a feasible strategy. And most of the text is going to be devoted on what your strategy is, why that's feasible. But even though this is the largest amount of text by volume, it's not necessarily the most important part. I would argue that the good question and the framing of that question is more important than simply describing your approach as well as you can. Again, this comes to setting the right direction and having a strategy that is worth pursuing. As we discussed, you start with why, and then talk about approach and results. So the success of what you're proposing is going to depend a lot on the proposal itself, and it's also going to depend on your track record, which for junior people, of course, is more limited, and for senior people becomes increasingly important. And different funding mechanisms differ in the extent to which they place emphasis on those components. In particular, HHMI is an example of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. It's an example of a funding mechanism that puts the majority of the emphasis on the track record of the PI. They fund the investigator more so than the project, while there are other funding opportunities that focus more on the proposal and put less emphasis on investigator, but in general, almost any funding mechanism is going to put emphasis on the investigator as well. And the more high risk the project is, the more important becomes a track record of showing that one has succeeded against difficult odds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about publishing, because probably that connects to the concerns that many people have of building a career, publication being one of the important ways in which we display our productivities as researchers. And when I think about that, I always put the emphasis on getting it right, having results that are really worthwhile publishing first. And then, of course, we have to think, how do we get credit for the work we have done so that we can also advance our career? And I like to think of the publication as being a two-stage process, and this is something beautifully articulated by other colleagues in the field as well, such as Ron Bale. So the first part is simply disclosing your result, which should be a rigorous scientific description of what you did that allows reproduction and allows evaluation. And the second part is the validation. And there are many ways in which the work can be validated, starting from relatively weak validation, such as peer review, somebody reading a paper and saying, this sounds plausible, I don't see an obvious flaw, to somebody repeating the exact procedures and getting the same result, which is a stronger validation, to somebody doing a different experiment that builds upon the suggested results and obtaining results consistent with the published model, which provides an orthogonal and usually stronger type of validation. So there are many, many ways of validating the results, and one shouldn't be fixated on peer review as being the only one. It's a useful one, it's an important one, but certainly not the only one. And then publishing is a way of beyond just disclosing the work, publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal, is a way of attracting attention. That's obvious, and that's the reason why junior people rightfully aspire to publish in the most prominent journal they can. But you should also keep in mind that the journal is only one way of attracting attention, an important way, but not the only way of attracting attention. There are many other ways in which you can promote your work. For example, you can promote access to it by writing compellingly and clearly, by making your research more accessible to others. They're likely to share it more and to talk about it. You can write blog posts about it, or you can engage on social media. And when you do that, my own strong preference is to try to do it in as substantive a way as I can. Try not only to say, wow, look at this paper, which carries no information of substance whatsoever, or say, I'm so excited that today we published our paper. Blah, why should you care that I'm excited? But say, we have this really exciting result. Just summarize that result in 1 or 2 sentences as well as you can, and try to give more framing that is going to encourage your colleagues to go and read the paper because they have found your short summary intriguing. And this is also to practice your communication. If you try to make your writing short blogs to promote not only your papers, but also the papers of other colleagues, you practice your scholarship, you practice your communication skills, you enlarge your professional network of colleagues who appreciate your thinking and your perspective on their research. And ultimately, by increasing your visibility, you also make your own work more visible. So I see it as being a win-win strategy for all. And they've summarized some more thoughts on this topic in this blog hyperlinked here. And of course, publishing doesn't mean that your result is correct. I think that by now, almost everybody appreciates that. It does have certain meaning. It means that it has passed a certain level of scrutiny. But as you can see in this example of 2 papers published in the prestigious journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, Two papers were published with diametrically opposing titles, claiming the opposite thing. And which of those papers is correct? Of course, you can read them as a researcher and try to evaluate for yourself, which ultimately is something that you have to learn to do and rely on your own judgment. But in this particular case, I think those papers demonstrate an example where the experimental design makes it very difficult to conclude and interpret the data. And that leaves space for biases. And this in particular is a question where different people tend to have different feelings about the utility of model organisms and to what extent model organisms faithfully reflect human biology. So think independently for every paper that you read, independent of the journal in which it was published, and try to have your own opinion. And the more important that paper for your research is, the more important it is for you to scrutinize it and to understand it, especially if you're going to build upon that paper. That paper being published in a prestigious journal is certainly not sufficient for you to have confidence that you can build upon it. Your time scrutinizing the paper before you start building upon its results will be time well spent. So I'm going to stop here, and because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I think engaging in a discussion with you is likely to be more fruitful and with me answering your questions rather than simply continuing this monologue of sharing my views. I'll be very happy to engage in a discussion and hope you have lots of questions.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. The presentation was insightful in many ways, but it was also clear and concise. And I think by giving us an example of what you actually meant for the researchers to do, it was even more useful to see it in action rather than, just hearing it, but maybe not imagining. For those of you who might not know this, Dr. Slavov, he's got a brilliant blog that I really would like everybody to have a look at, because it contains a lot of the tips and tricks that you've heard already, but they're, again, clear, concise, quite short, and they give you, just the gist of what you might find useful to improve your career as an early researcher. So we have a few questions that I definitely want to start asking, because I also think that the engaging bit is definitely when we get to interact. So one of the questions that we have received ahead of the session actually was relating to visibility, because it appears to be a big obstacle for many of the people who need to gain some territory in this field. And one of the questions was, social media is a great opportunity to showcase research. Could you please provide advice on how you would use social media effectively to promote your research?
My own view on that is that it pays to be very thoughtful in using social media. If you don't have much following to begin with, it's a good idea to start following thoughtful researchers whom you admire, who tweet substantive science-based ideas and research. And you can ask good questions or make good comments to what they have tweeted, which can help them engage. And by virtue of they having prominence and engaging with you, that will give you more prominence and will help you start building your network. I think sharing high quality content and discussing this as best as you can, showing that you're thinking about it, is a great way of building a strong following. There are people who use different strategies. That's not my strategy that I appreciate, but for the purposes of being comprehensive and complete, I'll share that. There are people who like sharing a lot of GIF images and jokes, and they can become very popular because of their jokes. I usually mute these people because I'm not interested in jokes on social media, but that's my personality. I have nothing against them. Some people like that. It might work for them. It's not something that resonates with me. And just to share my experience of starting with low visibility as a junior assistant professor, the first research article from my group was on developing a method for quantifying proteins by mass spectrometry in single cells. And this was something that the majority of people believed impossible, certainly the dominant experts of the field, and something that was rather difficult for us to published. By now, the method is well appreciated, highly cited, well established. But the early days were challenging in many ways because I started without having the reputation and the visibility that my group has now. And nonetheless, with having virtually no social media following, our paper went viral on Twitter because it was engaging and exciting. And they've seen this many times that even people who don't have Twitter following, if their message, if their work is exciting enough, that gets picked up by others who have more following and can still gain a lot of prominence and attention that way. So I think there's also this aspect, in addition to building your own visibility, which is wonderful, you should do and aspire to do. But even before you have that visibility and following, if the content that you share is engaging enough and provocative enough, hopefully in a good way, then it can be amplified by others.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this insight. I also think that it's kind of the beauty of the internet, well, the beauty and the danger, the fact that anything can become viral at any point, but in some cases it plays in our favor, the fact that, as you said, even somebody who doesn't have a big group of followers could rise to prominence if they have something that's truly engaging, that really gets people's attention. So I not only agree with that, but I find that a great opportunity for everybody who needs to kickstart their research career. Another question that came up during the conversation was actually about something that is quite relevant nowadays, which is mental health. Because some people might struggle with managing their time effectively when they really want to rise to prominence, they want to give it all, but it's not easy to balance everything. So the question is, how should we maintain productivity while avoiding burnout, in your experience?
I think that if you choose your strategy well, you don't need to work insane hours to be successful. You need to work hard, but this doesn't mean that you can forgo vacations. And in fact, I think vacations and time off are an important part of remaining creative and enjoying your life. And I think they're very good part of a healthy balance and work style that can be very successful. I do think that working hard is very important. Working with passion is very important, so that you work not only work, but you really actively, passionately desire to solve the problem. And then you make sure that you passionately desire to enjoy life and you know what that takes for you. For me, that is spending enough time outdoors. I love hiking, I love playing sports, I love spending time with friends, and I've always tried to make time for that. And frankly, the hardest part, which is relevant to many early career researchers, but for me, the hardest part has been not balancing my research with all these outside activities that make me happy, but balancing it with also raising young children. So that really pushes the limits. But I think even then, you can afford to do all of the important things that make you a happy human being and still be successful. And one thing that I want to mention in this context, a very important factor that I didn't include in my presentation, is your mentor. I think your mentor is incredibly important. And their mentors doesn't have to be a single one, but usually for PhD students, the doctoral mentor tends to be a dominant figure in their professional experience, and similarly can be for postdoctoral fellows. I think a good mentor can help with that and realize that can help you get the balance, can help focus and steer your efforts where they will be most fruitful without requiring that you burn out and you work 20 hours a day every day, which is not sustainable, not good for you, and not good for science.
Thanks for that too. I think a lot of the people are resonating with that because we're receiving quite some interesting comments, very, very supportive, very good comments as well in the chat. There's one more question that I'd like to ask because I think it kind of summarizes a few that we've received about application processes. So I would say one question that could summarize them is because, looking at it from a PI perspective, when you think of the qualities that a postdoc candidate should have, what do you anticipate being on top of those qualities? What do you think would be most important?
Oh, I love this question. I actually a little bit disagree with the common refrain that there is a shortage of postdoctoral applications. I think that what most people mean is that they don't find strong enough applications. Maybe some people also don't get any applications, but certainly from my perspective, I receive many, many dozens of applications per week. And the challenge is finding strong ones. It's not finding applications. And I think that there are a couple of very clear expectations on my side for a postdoctoral fellow. A, they should be the expert in whatever they did in their PhD work. It is difficult for me to evaluate a candidate for doctoral research, a PhD student, because they might be very bright and they never took linear algebra and they don't know what some basic concepts mean, which doesn't make them unsuitable for research. And even though they don't know basic things, they might be great, and therefore it's hard for me to evaluate them. In contrast, if a postdoctoral applicant is not able to answer questions about their research, that's a big red flag. They should know more about it than just about anybody else, including me, for the most part, of what they did as PhD students. So that's a clear expectation. The other clear expectation for me is that they should be able to propose at least a few projects that I would consider feasible and worthwhile doing. They may not be the best and the greatest. We might still spend months and months figuring out what's really a worthwhile project. For me, that bar is very high. I don't easily say that the project is great, but proposing something that is worthwhile doing and they have a reasonable plan, it's something that they should be able to do. If they're not able to do that, to me, that's unacceptable.
Thank you for that insight as well. Well, we have a bunch of exactly what we were hoping to get, actually, a bunch of different questions on many different aspects. I don't know if you'd like to have your pick in the Q&A section. We've received a lot. Otherwise, I might try and summarize one or two, but they're all pretty great.
Wonderful. Well, let's keep going. I'll use your help in summarizing them.
Fantastic. So some more people are wondering about grants and writing. So I think this is actually a pretty interesting one. Somebody asked, during a PhD or postdoc, if a person does not get exposure to grant writing exercises, do you think this might affect their career in academic research? And I would add, how do you prevent that from happening if you don't have any formal training?
Well, I think ideally you can ask your mentor for such opportunities, and they should help you with that. It doesn't need to be formal training in the sense of being coursework. I think this is actually a skill that is probably best developed in many ways in one-on-one interactions. When you try to write a proposal and then you get direct feedback from your mentor and then you revise it and you get feedback again. So that, I think, is a good way of developing it. If you don't get any of that interaction, I think it does make it a bit harder for you to learn, but I certainly don't think that this is an unsurmountable stumbling block. I did not get much experience in that beyond writing a proposal for my qualifying exam as a PhD student, which is part of many PhD programs. But I certainly, looking back at my own experience, I didn't get as much training as I think I could have, and getting more would have been beneficial. On the flip side, it's certainly not something that I couldn't compensate for it later on. I think following a few simple guidelines, such as always start with why, really have a great scientific idea and strategy, and writing with honesty and conceptual clarity, and trying to do this well and thinking about it can really take you quite far. If you know your science, I think you can do it well. In practice does help, you get better with it, but I think the bulk of it, the bulk of a very strong proposal, is really having a very good scientific idea for a project worthwhile doing, and then communicating that with clarity and passion, and that usually resonates with your reviewers.
Fantastic. Earlier, you spoke a little bit about creativity, which I think is something that gets neglected quite a lot in the research process, the fact that there's a lot of creativity in coming up with new ideas and new solutions. And some people picked it up in the conversation and actually asked questions about how do you get those ideas? How do you stimulate your creativity in the sense of finding new areas of research to explore, finding new angles from which you would like to explore those ideas? We've received quite a few, so I'm just trying to, summarize here. But yeah, any tips and tricks around creativity as a researcher?
I do have, yeah, absolutely. So, and before I share the tips and tricks, I'll say that creativity is probably one of the stronger competitive advantages of early career researchers, because creativity doesn't depend on having access to resources and established track record. Having more experience, knowing more about different areas can help. It can also inhibit you. So in the case when we started doing single cell proteomics by mass spectrometry, most established people simply knew that's not possible, and this did not help their creativity. So having the more new perspective on that was a clear advantage. I think what helps with creativity is a quality that's probably shared by many of the researchers in our audience, which is being curious for a lot of different things. As a scientist, at any stage of your career, especially early on, you need to be focused enough on a project to make headway, to make progress. But being focused on one or two projects doesn't necessitate that you're not interested in anything else and you don't have peripheral vision. I think preserving your broad curiosity and peripheral vision, going on the departmental seminar, that sounds interesting and unrelated to your doctoral research, is a good way for you to be exposed to new ideas, new approaches, which then you can apply to your own research in some creative way. So I think part of it is retaining your curiosity, nurturing your curiosity, and learning very broadly of different areas that can be completely unrelated to your field, but nonetheless can have similar ideas. The annals of research history are filled with examples of very significant innovations coming from such cross-fertilization from distant fields. An idea from quantum mechanics being taken and applied to physical chemistry or molecular biology and taking different shape of its own, but nonetheless bearing resemblance to its intellectual origins in quantum mechanics. So being curious and also not overworking, allowing yourself time to daydream and explore and enjoy whatever it is that makes you happy and makes you a fulfilled human being, I think is an important aspect of nurturing your creativity. And again, I don't think that overworking is required for you to be successful if you have chosen a productive direction. And if you have not chosen a productive direction, you can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's just not going to take you far.
I couldn't agree more. And especially that last comment, it kind of feeds back into the mental health domain that we were discussing beforehand. So I think they go hand in hand in that sense of allowing yourself to actually be able to be creative is the first step towards finding those novel ideas. Then I'm sure you will have so many more tips and so many more ideas. For many of the questions that people have asked, first of all, thank you so much, everybody, for being so participative. Many answers you will find on Dr. Slava's blog. I would like to reiterate that because it's very rich in content. You'll see a lot of, somebody asked for like a checklist of things that one should be aiming to do. Some of those things you can really find on his blog. So please do have a look, do spend some time looking into all the material that he produces, all the thought leadership pieces that he creates, because they are extremely insightful. We have a few more questions, but I think we're already hitting the clock in a way. So thank you so much for your time and for everything that you've shared with us today. It was absolutely brilliant to spend this session together and get your insights. Again, for anyone who would like to ask any more questions in the future, we're going to leave the slides and the contacts of Dr. Slavov, so you might be able to go more in depth with everything that he's already discussed today. Thanks again, everybody. This is the end of our session, and thanks, Dr. Slavov, for your wonderful contribution.